one thing that has truly goaded me for quite some time
without support services,
is this
especially
mythos, right, of an autism epidemic. And it's been driving me crazy, you know, for a long time, because I know some things that for some
without support.
reason we seem to have forgotten, for the most part about autism. And it made me, need to show you something, only it will take time. And one thing you should know is that, basically the diagnostic criteria for autism has broadened by such an extreme amount that, because our methods for detecting autism have improved towards such an extent and have basically, become much more broadly inclusive, you could explain a rise as high as even, 10, 15,000%, you know, on the basis of, broadened diagnostic criteria. It's not limited to the 25%, in the autism speaks graphs. Like, you could go even higher than the rates that we've had, and much higher, and it would be explained by the, the shifting diagnostic criteria. More and more people are accessing, healthcare. They're accessing, you know, how can we not, for instance, assign, part of the blame for the rising diagnoses, given, the criteria, for instance, by the fact that Obamacare passed and more people, now have access to healthcare and to health insurance than previously did. And those people went and took their kids and themselves into psychiatrists and went to therapists. And at their therapist office, they got, referrals to autism experts and were basically diagnosed that way. I mean, how do you not attribute these factors? I mean, for one thing, the diagnostic criteria shifted. On top of that, more people now have health insurance than previously did. Like, all these things and factors combined together, and they basically explain the epidemic without any need
Just have
for, there to be something in the water, so to speak. And I'm not being literal about the water supply being, having a problem with it. I'm being metaphorical. So, I mean, you don't need a vaccine. You don't need you don't need something that's changed in the environment, externally, to basically explain the rising rates. I mean, when internally, you not only have a world in which the diagnostic criteria has shifted, but more people up now suddenly have access to the very people that would diagnose
after
in the
Christmas
first
last
place.
year, 132 kids in California got the measles by either visiting
And so I'm asking for your
Disneyland
13 minutes
or being
or
exposed to someone
14.
who'd been there. The virus then hopped the Canadian border,
And that was back in March of 2015. So, it's dated at this point, this video.
infecting more than 100 children in Quebec.
But this video still has
One of the
value.
tragic things about this outbreak is that measles, which can be fatal to a child with a weakened immune system.
And I want to make some notes here. That is actually true. I don't know that it necessarily depends on a weakened immune system as so much as just being the unlucky one, to draw the unlucky straw. Now, measles is, in most cases, a harmless, thing that happens to people. It truly, for the most part, you get over it very quickly, and it's not doesn't have any lasting consequences. But in a small minority of children, there's this thing called measles encephalitis, which, effectively means brain swelling. And when it happens, and you get, CCPE, it's pretty much a death sentence. There's no known treatment for it. Even if you happen to survive, the outcomes can be diminished quality of life, to say the least. The it's pretty, but it's almost invariably a death sentence. If you survive it, you're incredibly lucky, and even if you do, you probably would have rather died, with it. And the the trouble, in a lot of ways with measles is exactly that. And One thing I saw is somebody actually did the math at the rates, which it happened, and they imagined a scenario which would never actually happen because there are always going to be people that don't get infected or don't live a different way than other people in the nation, and so they don't end up like myself, for example, and so they don't end up getting infected because they're not as exposed to other people and individuals. They don't spend as much time around other people, and so they have a lower propensity to actually gain infections from others. And so when so one thing that a math major will tell you, and I realize that this is going to take more than 14 minutes of your time because of the fact that I'm adding this on, but if you take a very large number, that's in the millions, and that number is really more like 350, 400 million people, and then you take a rate of like 0.7% of those people, and you're still going to get a number that's in the hundreds of thousands, as far as that's concerned. So a very large number, if you take a small percentage of a very large number, you still end up with a rather large number. And so estimations of measles encephalitis rates that would actually happen if everybody in the United States were to get infected are that about 700,000 children would die. That would never actually happen, but that gives you some idea of the prevalence of
Is one
measles
of the most easily
encephalitis.
preventable diseases in the world. An effective vaccine against it has been available for more than half a century, but many of the kids involved in the Disneyland outbreak had not been vaccinated because their parents were afraid of something allegedly even worse: autism.
Now, I want you to know this. As somebody that got diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, is succeeding on many of my goals, like getting my credit rating up and retooling towards getting my license, learning how to drive, going to school, building a future for myself and everything. And my future is not as bleak as you would have people believe. But people on the spectrum are limited to. I can deal with a lot of things that a lot of people on the spectrum probably couldn't. Like I pride myself every time I get on public transit because it's like I'm dealing with something that I know a lot of autistic people would struggle with. Riding the bus. But I, uh, I have to say, in putting this all together, my life isn't as bleak as they're making it out to be, and it's hard not to take it personally when people are essentially telling you, "I would rather roll the dice on my child ending up dead than them ending up like you."
But wait, wasn't the paper that sparked the controversy about autism and vaccines debunked, retracted, and branded a deliberate fraud by the British Medical Journal? Don't most science savvy people know that the theory that vaccines cause autism is BS? I think most of you do. But millions of parents worldwide continue to fear that vaccines put their kids at risk for autism. Why? Here's why.
Now, you can't see it in here, and it's such a problem.
This is a graph of autism prevalence estimates rising over time. For most of the 20th century, autism was
So
considered
right there,
an
down there in the
incredibly rare
corner,
condition.
at the bottom of that Autism Speaks graph, there's a in small writing, there's an objection that basically says that recent research has suggested that 25% of this graph could be potentially explained by shifts in the diagnostic criteria. But that graph is pretty old from Autism Speaks. It's pretty dated at this point, and we've likely been through two versions of the DSM by this point, the DSM-4 and the DSM-5, which both had the effect of broadening diagnostic criteria. See, I was diagnosed in 1999 with Asperger's syndrome. That was what I was given at that point. We had gone for quite some time without any um, diagnosis. We had suspicions, but we knew that we weren't exhibiting all the signs of low functioning autistics. We I was much more functional than the people that need like daily care and that sort of thing. Like I didn't need that kind of somebody else to wipe my ass sort of autism. I had the more high functioning version of it.
Few psychologists and pediatricians who'd even heard of it figured that they would get through their entire careers without seeing a single case. For decades, the prevalence estimates remained stable at just 3 or 4 children in 10,000. But then in the 1990s, the numbers started to skyrocket. Fundraising organizations like Autism Speaks.
Now, I want you to, I want to encourage you when you look at that graph to think in two different ways. I want you to ask the question, are autism rates actually going up, or is it just a rise in autism diagnoses? Because there's a difference between the two. Those are not the same thing. I mean, are more people being diagnosed with it, or are there actually more autistics? And, I would tell you that basically, because the diagnostic criteria has shifted, because the methodologies for detecting it have improved, because we consider people that we didn't used to consider autistic, the rates are going up. But it's there's more to this story than just that. I mean, they try to say that only 25% of that can be explained by, the rise in it, and I'm actually like, diagnostic criteria could explain a lot more than 25%. Like that is not what it's limited to. It could explain the whole graph. Like, for one thing, it's not just, a shift in diagnostic criteria, but on top of that, I mean, think about the last couple of years and decades of US politics. What was one big event that happened, like, after 2008? The election of America's first black president, right? Barack Obama, who passed into law the Affordable Care Act, which came to be known as Obamacare by a lot of people, but they're the same thing. You know, a lot of people don't know that there's a connection at the same, thing. Very strange that they don't know this, but this bill did a lot to, guarantee access to a much larger pool of people that did not, formerly have healthcare, and why we don't have truly universal healthcare in the United States, even to this day. We have, included a lot of people that we would not have otherwise been able to include. So, what do you want to bet the odds are that a lot of those people that formerly would not have access to the mental health, sector, suddenly decided, I've got a child, he's exhibiting what I perceive to be signs of autism, and then took their child to the doctor and, went down the path that my mother was forced down because of my problems that I encountered in school, to get a formal diagnosis, and there's a story there, and I don't want to get into it tonight, but
Routinely referred to autism as an epidemic, as if you could catch it from another kid at Disneyland. So what's going on? If it isn't vaccines, what is it? If you ask the folks down at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta what's going on, they tend to rely on phrases like broadened diagnostic criteria.
And the thing is, the people at the CDC are right. I mean, I saw somebody that talked about a CDC study that basically said that rates had risen by like 34, percent, and all I could think is, did you interpret that CDC report accurately? Because that CDC report probably used language like autism diagnoses have risen 30%, but that CDC report probably didn't actually mean autism rates themselves have gone up. It probably meant autism diagnosis rates have gone up. And there's, like I said, I'm encouraging you to think critically about this. Think that there's a difference between autism rates going up and autism diagnosis rates going up.
And better case finding to explain these rising numbers.
So basically, we're better at detecting autism.
That kind of language doesn't do much to allay the...
And yes, he's right. He has a point, because people want, we're an emotional species that wants, like, storytelling and everything. It wants the story.
Fears of a young mother who is searching her 2-year-old's face for eye contact. If the diagnostic criteria had to be broadened, why were they so narrow in the first place? Why were cases of autism so hard to find before the 1990s?
And this is really important
5
stuff.
years ago, I decided to try to uncover the answers to these questions. I learned that what happened has less to do with the slow and cautious progress of science than it does with the seductive power of storytelling. For most of the 20th century, clinicians told one story about what autism is and how it was discovered. But that story turned out to be wrong, and the consequences of it are having a devastating impact on global public health. There was a second, more accurate story of autism, which had been lost and forgotten in obscure corners of the clinical literature. This second story tells us everything about how we got here and where we need to go next. The first story starts with a child psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins Hospital named Leo Kanner. In 1943, Kanner published a paper describing 11 young patients who seemed to inhabit private worlds, ignoring the people around them, even their own parents. They could amuse themselves for hours by flapping their hands in front of their faces, but they were panicked by little things like their favorite toy being moved from its usual place without their knowledge. Based on the patients who were brought to his clinic, Kanner speculated that autism is very rare. By the 1950s, as the world's leading authority on the subject, he declared that he had seen less than 150 true cases of his syndrome while fielding referrals from as far away as South Africa. That's actually not surprising, because Kanner's criteria for diagnosing autism were incredibly selective. For example, he discouraged giving the diagnosis to children who had seizures, but now we know that epilepsy is very common in autism. He once bragged that he had turned 9 out of 10 kids referred to his office as autistic by other clinicians without giving them an autism diagnosis. Kanner was a smart guy, but a number of his theories didn't pan out. He classified autism as a form of infantile psychosis caused by cold and unaffectionate parents. These children, he said, have been kept neatly in a refrigerator that didn't defrost. At the same time, however, Kanner noticed that some of his young patients had special abilities that clustered in certain areas, like music, math, and memory. One boy in his clinic could distinguish between 18 symphonies before he turned 2. When his mother put on one of his favorite records, he would correctly declare, Beethoven. But Kanner took a dim view of these abilities, claiming that the kids were just regurgitating things they'd heard their pompous parents say, desperate to earn their approval. As a result, autism became a source of shame and stigma for families, and 2 generations of autistic children were shipped off to institutions for their own good, becoming invisible to the world at large. Amazingly, it wasn't until the 1970s that researchers began to test Kanner's theory that autism was rare. Lorna Wing was a cognitive psychologist in London who thought that Kanner's theories of refrigerator parenting were bloody stupid, as she told me. She and her husband John were warm and affectionate people, and they had a profoundly autistic daughter named Susie. Lorna and John knew how hard it was to raise a child like Susie without support services, special education, and the other resources that are out of reach without a diagnosis. To make the case to the National Health Service that more resources were needed for autistic children and their families, Lorna and her colleague Judith Gould decided to do something that should have been done 30 years earlier. They undertook a study of autism prevalence in the general population. They pounded the pavement in a London suburb called Camberwell to try to find autistic children in the community. What they saw made clear that Kanner's model was way too narrow, while the reality of autism was much more colorful and diverse. Some kids couldn't talk at all, while others waxed on at length about their fascination with astrophysics, dinosaurs, or the genealogy of royalty. In other words, these children didn't fit into nice, neat boxes, as Judith put it, and they saw lots of them. way more than Connor's monolithic model would have predicted. At first, they were at a loss to make sense of their data. How had no one noticed these children before? But then Lorna came upon a reference to a paper that had been published in German in 1944, the year after Connor's paper, and then forgotten, buried with the ashes of a terrible time that no one wanted to remember or think about. Connor knew about this competing paper, but scrupulously avoided mentioning it in his own work. It had never even been translated into English, but luckily, Lorna's husband spoke German, and he translated it for her. The paper offered an alternate story of autism. Its author was a man named Hans Asperger, who ran a combination...
Now, I want you, again, some caveats to what he's saying. Hans Asperger is now... His name is Mud at this point, and it's because, you know, people who know their history at this point, you know, like myself included, like, I'm fascinated by history. We now know that Hans likely collaborated to a much greater extent with the Nazis than we previously knew, and you know, we just didn't want this man to be honored with the name of a disease named after him, you know, considering that, you know, he had been, you know, he likely sent some children to their death, basically. But then again, you know, when you're in Nazi Germany, what choice as a doctor do you have?
School in Vienna in the 1930s.
It's hard. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, while there were people that resisted the Nazis in this, you know, in this time period and everything, and they did so at the risk of their own lives, you know, there was no way to, you know, like I said, to go up against the Nazis without putting your life in peril in Europe.
Asperger's ideas about teaching children with learning differences were progressive even by contemporary standards. Mornings at his clinic began with exercise classes set to music, and the children put on plays on Sunday afternoons. Instead of blaming parents for causing autism, Asperger framed it as a lifelong polygenetic disability that requires compassionate forms of support and accommodations over the course of one's whole life. Rather than treating the kids in his clinic like patients, Asperger called them his little professors and enlisted their help in developing methods of education that were particularly suited to them. Crucially, Asperger viewed autism as a diverse continuum that spans an astonishing range of giftedness and disability. He believed that autism and autistic traits are common and always have been, seeing aspects of this continuum in familiar archetypes from pop culture, like the socially awkward scientist and the absent-minded professor. He went so far as to say, it seems that for success in science and art, a dash of autism is essential. Lorna and Judith realized that Connor had been as wrong about autism being rare as he had been about parents causing it. Over the next several years, they quietly worked with the American Psychiatric Association to broaden the criteria for diagnosis to reflect the diversity of what they called the autism spectrum. In the late 80s and early 1990s, their changes went into effect, swapping out Connor's narrow model for Asperger's broad and inclusive one. These changes weren't happening in a vacuum. By coincidence, as Lorna and Judith worked behind the scenes to reform the criteria, people all over the world were seeing an autistic adult for the first time. Before Rain Man came out in 1988, only a tiny ingrown circle of experts knew what autism looked like. But after Dustin Hoffman's unforgettable performance as Raymond Babbitt earned Rain Man 4 Academy Awards, pediatricians, psychologists, teachers, and parents all over the world knew what autism looked like. Coincidentally, at the same time, the first easy-to-use clinical tests for diagnosing autism were introduced. You no longer had to have a connection to that tiny circle of experts to get your child evaluated. The combination of Rain Man, the changes to the criteria, And the introduction of these tests created a network effect, a perfect storm of autism awareness. The number of diagnoses started to soar, just as Lorna and Judith predicted, indeed hoped that it would, enabling autistic people and their families to finally get the support and services they deserved. Then Andrew Wakefield came along to blame the spike in diagnoses on vaccines. A simple, powerful, and seductively believable story that was as wrong as Connor's theory that autism was rare. If the CDC's current estimate that 1 in 68 kids in America are on the spectrum is correct, autistics are one of the largest minority groups in the world. In recent years, autistic people have come together on the internet to reject the notion that they are puzzles to be solved by the next medical breakthrough, coining the term neurodiversity to celebrate the varieties of human cognition. One way to understand neurodiversity is to think in terms of human operating systems. Just because a PC is not running Windows doesn't mean that it's broken. By autistic standards, the normal human brain is easily distractible, obsessively social, and suffers from a deficit of attention to detail. To be sure, autistic people have a hard time living in a world not built for them. 80 years later, we're still catching up to Asperger, who believe that the cure for the most disabling aspects of autism is to be found in understanding teachers, accommodating employers, supportive communities, and parents who have faith in their children's potential. An autistic woman named Zosha Zaks once said, "We need all hands on deck to right the ship of humanity." As we sail into an uncertain future, we need every form of human intelligence on the planet working together to tackle the challenges that we face as a society. We can't afford to waste a brain. Thank you.
So, if you've stuck with me, which is not all that likely 30 minutes later, but if I've had your 30 minutes, thank you for your time. And please understand that, my overall point here is that we've always had this many autistics. We just didn't call them autistic. When you start applying the label to people that were formerly called something else in the past, diagnostic criteria go up. But one thing that went unmentioned in that video, like I stated, was that, Barack Obama was elected the president of the United States, and with it, control of Congress also passed to the Democratic Party. And when they were in power, they decided to, use the reconciliation process to bypass the filibuster and enact Obamacare, and otherwise known as the Affordable Care Act, which, despite numerous cries to repeal it and roll it back, all they've managed to repeal is the individual mandate at this point. They've failed and failed and failed and failed and failed and failed and failed to replace it. So, or remove it at all, and it remains a salient fact at this point. So, that also contributes to the perfect storm scenario that was mentioned in the video. Like, Autism Speaks may have a graph that says 600%, but you take the better improved methodologies for detecting autism, broadened diagnostic criteria, the DSM loosening the standards over two, editions, the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. You take all of that, you take the fact that access to the healthcare system has also gotten a lot better. There are a lot more experts in, the field and that are interested in autism at this point. There are a lot more psychiatrists that have taken an interest in it, given that there's more patients that are likely to be presenting with symptoms related to the broadened criteria. And, you take the fact that more people are actually able to access the healthcare system, and there you go. I mean, you've explained away the entire chart. 600% rise. Makes sense. It's consistent with everything that's happened. You don't need, a factor like, there's something in the water, or there's something in the food we eat, or it's a vaccine that we're injecting people with to explain the autism speaks graphs. There is no true autism epidemic. All that has truly happened is that the diagnostic criteria has expanded, and we are now calling people that we didn't formerly call autistic. The label is being slapped on people it didn't used to be slapped on, which effectively means that, at the end of the day, you've got a 600% rise in diagnoses, whether or not autistic people have, the autistic portion of the population has grown or not, And so when you're looking at, reports from the CDC that say that, autism diagnoses have gone up by X amounts, what you need to understand is, you know, of course, I mean, of course, diagnoses have gone up. They've changed the diagnostic criteria, they've expanded it, and on top of that, more people have access to the healthcare system, and more people that work in healthcare are basically educated in the new methodologies. Like, do you realize that there's a ton of factors at this point that go into it. So is there an autism epidemic? Truly, no, there isn't. There's maybe maybe there has been an explosion in the number of people being diagnosed with autism, but autistics and our share and proportion of the US population have stood still.